seeing some of the accomplishments that was made, you felt good about that. But at the same time, we knew that the things that we stood for, the things that we were fighting for, that fight still had to continue.
We still hadn't resolved the problem of humanity being considered human. It forced the nation to face the fact that African Americans in Mississippi were not being treated with equal protection under the law that is to be afforded to all citizens. It changed the course of history, not only for Mississippi, not only for the South, but for the nation.
So that type sense that I'm not going to vote for Lyndon Johnson.
With even the Democratic governor voting Republican, Mississippi party politics shifted away from its solidly Democratic base.
The very notion that African Americans are equal to whites in this state is something that many whites could not take. And so we seen from that point a mass exodus of whites in Mississippi leaving the Democratic Party, going to the Republican Party.
But the Freedom Democrats, who had been rebuffed by President Johnson, actually campaigned for him in his run against Republican Barry Goldwater.
From that moment on, here and in other southern states, there was an effort to get a new black leadership from an upper middle class group who could play by traditional rules. Humphrey came in with the war on poverty and openly saying that that would be a way to build a new interracial Democratic Party.
But it still wasn't egalitarian.
Whoever the black leaders were that emerged would have to be acceptable.
In the months following Freedom Summer, black voter registration remained low.
6.7% of the eligible, under the 15th Amendment, eligible African-American population in Mississippi was registered to vote, which was, even compared to other southern states, was remarkably low.
Then, on August 6, 1965, President Lyndon Johnson signed another piece of landmark legislation, the Voting Rights Act.
We then began to see a tremendous increase in participation of African Americans in the electoral process. They wanted to have a voice, that in the democracy, public policy is developed and determined at the polling place.
Robert Chin saw the impact in Canton.
You had fellow registrars to come in and set up office down on P Street. And man, we got folks registered. We got thousands of folks registered in Madison County that year.
By 1968, the next presidential election, close to 60% of Mississippi African Americans were registered, which was the highest in the region.
But what was not accounted for was this thing called redistricting.
The largely black Mississippi Delta had long been the second congressional district. When the Voting Rights Act became law, Mississippi redrew the boundary lines so that the black population fell into 4 separate congressional districts.
In essence, they nullified that which the Voting Rights Act was supposed to have given us. Dividing the Delta area up between 4 different congressional districts made sure that black people in Mississippi would not be able to elect a representative of their choosing.
Or, if voters did elect a black official, his authority would be mitigated by the majority whites.
So it's like you celebrate this victory and you're wondering what is happening to you. Later you find out that you've been tricked, sidestepped again.
It took State Senator Henry Kirksey 14 years and 9 trips to the United States Supreme Court to get more equitable district lines drawn.
Well, I feel this is a great step. This will open the door up for the people of my race. And I think this is going to change the thinking of some of our people who have been reluctant about using the ballot.
1967 marked another voting milestone in Mississippi. Robert G. Clark was elected to the State House. He was the first black legislator since Reconstruction.
Perhaps more significant than his election to the legislature was that on the municipal level, you had a number of African Americans who were elected in that time. But it was in majority black counties and cities that you really saw the exercise of African American voting power.
By the summer of 1968, 4 years had passed since the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party had challenged at the National Democratic Convention.
We had won a ruling that at the next Democratic Convention, 1968, and forever after, you could not exclude any group. And by the time of 68, that meant women, and it meant college students, and over the next 30 years, it meant Hispanics and American Indians, or any kind of a subgroup which could prove that they were denied their rights as Americans.
The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was once again headed to the National Convention, and they were seated, at least some. The delegates included members from the NAACP, the Freedom Democrats, as well as Young Democrats.
It was a loyalist delegation, people that identified with the National Democratic Party.
The 70s. Most Mississippi schools desegregated. William Waller and later William Winter were elected governor. They were men who were progressive on race, and the increased black vote helped put them in office. And while there was still a dearth on the statewide level, by the middle of the 1970s, Mississippi had more black elected officials than any other southern state.
In our election 2014 coverage, Mississippi voters will have to follow new voter ID laws when they go to the polls for the primaries tomorrow.
We're still fighting 1960 fights. Voter ID is the one that we're facing with right now.
Every study that's been done shows that it will have a disparate impact on African Americans, on the poor, on the elderly.
All you got to do is dismantle or discourage 10 or 15% in the whole complexion of any election changes. Why shouldn't we have early voting? Why shouldn't we have same-day registration? We have the systems in place. You show up, you present your information, you can register, and you can vote on the spot. That's a free, open democracy.
And today, activists are also concerned about the recent Supreme Court changes in the Voting Rights Act.
They removed the pre-clearance provision for the old segregationist states, essentially.
The state of Mississippi, for any other state, really is unfettered in the way in which they change election laws.
And if we don't do something about those, then it's going to be some more sad days in Mississippi and this country as a whole.
But evolving demographics also hold potential for change.
Mississippi in 20 years is not going to look like Mississippi of today, and it's certainly not going to look like Mississippi of 20 years ago.
Older voters, people who went to segregated schools, tend to vote along racial lines.
Once they leave the electorate, they're going to be replaced by voters that are not nearly as conservative as they are. The stasis that has persisted through Mississippi politics for a long time may well reach a pretty radical breaking point in the next 10 to 20 years.
So today is we could figure out how do you get the students to make that same stand.
I think that young people have to be at the forefront of combating the things that discriminate against people that live in this country, and they also have to be at the forefront of providing solutions that open this country up to everybody that's here.
And then what can we do to change the things that have deprived a lot of Mississippians of the quality of life and the respect, the rights that they deserve?
and look around where you live. And if you do that, you will find a lot of things that need to be done away with, a lot of things that need to be changed for the better. If there are organizations that are already working on those, see about joining those. If there are not organizations, then look at starting one.
But the civil rights veterans aren't resting either.
The struggle continues, and it's no stopping place, no rest. You can retreat for a minute, but the struggle goes on.
For people to brush off their hands and say it's done, it's not done. It's almost just begun.
With all of what is going on, with all of the things that need to be done, as long as I have some strength and energy to do something to make that better, I want to be found doing that.
You can find out more information about the many aspects of Freedom Summer and take a simple literacy test at our website at mpbonline.org/1964.
The real heroes of the movement, in my opinion, were the local people still. The people who lived in the backwoods and stuff like that, we still don't know what happened to a lot of them. And they had to face this by themselves on a daily basis. So they have the willingness to stand up and go to the polls and to go to Atlantic City. Took much, much more courage than a lot of us who were not from Mississippi.
Many people that we know nothing about, we don't talk about, that did so much to make it possible that, I could do the little I did, so I'm always humbled by the thought of what they went through.